Thank you so much, Iftikhar, Ustaz Iftikhar, I must say, and thank you to the Muslim Institute and for this, wonderful gathering. I'm very much looking forward to discussing a few points and then hopefully hearing your questions and interacting with you. As you said, I'm from Palestine, from Gaza in particular, so I come from that region, and it's been a very hard time because I have family there, and I'm just talking with my friend Naomi, and they have been displaced a few times, so it's it only gets harder, unfortunately. But today we'll go through a kind of a journey back in time, and we'll start talking about the cultural history of the Palestinian people. And as my friend said here, that the Palestinian people have a sort of a long-standing, it's actually very hard for me to see this, but you can see it? Yeah. They have a long-standing presence in the area of Palestine, uninterrupted presence. But it's a kind of shaped by geography, migration, and historical events. And I hope you see some of this geography, at least in this image. Anyone recognizes where this image is from? No, this is where? Anyway, this is quite a famous village in the West Bank. I don't show you, what? This is the village of Battir, which goes back thousands of years ago, I think. And they say sort of this type of structure, houses, go back to the sort of Canaan era, the Canaanite era that we have mentioned, or some of you have mentioned before. So I'll be talking about the geography and the migration and historical events, and I'll also be talking about the resilience and adaptability, and tradition, art and literature and music and food. Obviously, I can't cover every aspect, but get a sense of what has been there and what is there, and we'll try to explore the cultural evolution and heritage of the Palestinian people. So as we said, Palestinian history dates back to Canaan. I don't really you mentioned Edward Said. Edward Said talks a lot about, instead of talking about history in terms of origins, it's easier to talk about it in terms of beginnings. And he has a whole book where he makes the distinction between what he calls origins, which sort of tends to be religious or mythical, and tend to be literal, and between beginnings, which is emphasizing that human beings make history and they have agency in the making of history. But I also think that what is called popular history, or how people refer to their history, is very important. And when I grew up in Gaza, we often, our history, we say we are Canaaniyin, we are Ahfad al-Canaaniyin, the ancestors of the Canaanites. And this is a group of people who were in Syria, in Lebanon, and they were also made up of different tribes. So when one looks at the scholarship of who the Canaanites were, it's actually not a very homogeneous sort of group of people. It's quite complicated, as history tends to be all the time. But that's the sort of background that Palestinians refer to, and it's mentioned obviously in the Bible and other sources, but one cannot treat the Bible as a book of history. That's another thing. So, but it's clear that the Palestinians, considering this sort of geography, were influenced by the Egyptian, Mesopotamian. These are the first cultures that Palestinians were part of. You can't say Palestinians were. For example, Palestinians are always referring to the Hyksos as the first people who settled, a group of Egyptians called Hyksos who settled in Gaza. And the documents from the Amarna archive show some sites that refer to that background. And Mesopotamia, which is the migration, Akkadian, Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian migrations that also settled in Palestine. We get a clearer record with the Greek and the Roman cultures that settled in Palestine. So Palestine have a Hellenistic culture, and then later on Latin culture, and then later on Byzantine and etc. So Palestine is known for trade, for a cultural exchange due to the strategic location. We talk about the Sahel region in Palestine, for example, which is Gaza, Haifa. This is a very well-known area. It's the sort of, in the sense that being the focal point between Africa and the Asia continent, and it was a trade route that civilizations before traveled through, people traveled through for trade purposes. So this is quite well documented. Unfortunately, there's a very good museum in Gaza about the Greek heritage, or there was, before it was destroyed just a few months ago in this war. There were very good pieces, and some of them have been taken by the Israelis, and they're unaccounted for, as they stole objects before in Beirut when they went and kicked out the Palestinian Liberation Organization in 1982. So this is another part to this story. And then I think we have also the Byzantine, the Greek and the Byzantine. Alexander the Great conquered, brought Hellenistic influence. They have the Romans brought architectural advancement and trade routes, and we have flourishing Christian community. The region became a site and pilgrimage, and we have development of monasteries and churches, and some of which still stand today. This type of structure that you see in the image is quite common in Palestine, in Jordan, the mosaic, and I think it actually you see a similar picture on, if you know, Noor Masalha's book, 4,000 Palestine, 4,000 years history. So Palestine is, it's known for the Nativity Church, the Sepulchre Church, the birth of Christianity is in Palestine. And some of these sites are still there. We have a church in Gaza again, the Orpheus Church that was destroyed also recently. That's also another very sad. And we are speaking about history, but living history that is destroyed as we speak. We are speaking about the Greek and Roman influence. Unfortunately, some of the temples in Baalbek city in Lebanon, and this has to be mentioned, they have also been affected by the ferocious bombing that happened, but particularly over the last 5 days in Lebanon. So there's a lot of devastation of history there, and visible sites, like witnesses to history that are being destroyed as we speak. So this is really very, very sad. Then we talk about the arrival of Islam. You have architectural elements, the most obvious and obviously famous of which is the Dome of the Rock. And we have also Hebron and Gaza became center for Islamic scholarship. Actually, Gaza, and particularly Gaza, was a very well-known sort of place for learning rhetoric and philosophy. So you have even some Greek philosophers born there, and they died in Gaza. And it's quite the document, the archaeological evidence is quite clear on that. And there's actually a whole chapter in Masalha's book talking about the contributions of Gaza in terms of before Islam, particularly during the Hellenistic period, to world history in terms of particularly rhetoric, being a place where many schools of rhetoric were there. With Islam, perhaps the most famous, Gaza is called Ghazat Hashim, the Gaza of Hashim bin Manaf, who's the grandfather of Prophet Muhammad. And this is one of 7th century, before the trade route coming from all the way through the Bilad al-Sham, Syria, Palestine, which is called Mount Lebanon, Palestine. And this is where he was buried, the grandfather of Prophet Muhammad, in Gaza. And obviously the Dome of the Rock is a very important site. And again, it's also threatened, unfortunately, as we speak, by all sorts of schemes that are going on to build a temple instead of this remarkable structure that is very important to Palestinian identity and Palestinian history. And actually the mosque in Hebron, Al-Masjid al-Ibrahimi, it's actually been taken by settlers. Particularly recently, they even have stopped people from doing the adhan and prayers in the Hebron area. And this is, again, an old mosque that goes back to at least to the 7th century, if not before, being other sort of structures. So this is, again, cultural history that is subjected to damage and to destruction as we speak, unfortunately. Then I think, there's so much there, history. And obviously, I think another thing about Jerusalem and all these places, Bethlehem, Gaza in particular, they all have, throughout history, have different communities. So you have Muslims, you have Jews, and you have Christians. And they kind of live together, and they have their churches, they have their mosques, they have their synagogues, and they live together. I mean, I think before this is quite clearly evident. It's been throughout the history of Palestine. And then they have the Ottoman Empire, which conquered Palestine or captured in 1517 to 1918, 1917, 1918. It's a very important empire, as you know, that has introduced so much to Palestine by way of architecture. We have even inside Al-Aqsa Mosque, you go to Istanbul and you see some of the structure in very much similar to the ones that exist in Istanbul. So the type of mosques that exist in Istanbul or in Turkey of today, some of the structures were introduced to Al-Aqsa Mosque during the Ottoman Empire. And affected the food culture, affected the music culture. The Ottoman Empire was huge in shaping what we call the modern Arab world in terms of food, in terms of architecture, in terms of music, etc. So the Palestinians, as you know, they speak Arabic, and Arabic is the language of the Quran, the language of Islam. And it's the language that is the language of the literary tradition in particular. And the Palestinians have tapped into this literary tradition, which I'll be talking about in a minute. But it's sort of influenced of poetry and prose. Poets like Mahmoud Darwish explored themes of love and exile and identity. And there's oral storytelling and folk poetry tradition, part of the cultural influences in Palestine. So before Islam, obviously, Palestine had many cultures within it. Like Palestine was not, it's never been a homogeneous country. It always have different religions, have different cultures, but united by certain historical currents. And Islam changed the entire what came to be called the Arab world. Particularly in the sense of language, like the language become the emblem, the symbol that unites all the people living in that region. Despite that, you have certain communities who kept, like Aramaic influences, for example, stayed in some places in Syria and in Palestine, and also Hebrew, but at a very sort of minor level in comparison with Arabic, which is by the 7th and 8th century became the main language of the area of Palestine. These type of musical tradition also are so. Palestine, like the rest of the Arab world, was influenced by, particularly in what we call the modern period, 16th century onwards, by the Persian culture and by the Turkish culture, the Ottoman culture. They're absolutely essential to the formation of the cultural sort of makeup of the Arab world, particularly when it comes to food, music, and even sometimes a dress code, but particularly food and music. So, and Palestine has taken this to heart, particularly the music element. It's very, very remarkable and very important. And each Palestinian city or villages, they have their own musical tradition. But the main division when it comes to music is between the village and the town. And particularly during the British colonialism in Palestine, music was very important to galvanize and mobilize the people through music, through songs against the British colonialism in Palestine. And also currently, I've just been recently working on a chapter about the songs from Gaza. And it's absolutely been essential. I think one of you have asked about how people are coping with psychologically. And song and nasheed, recitation, has been very, very essential to the people there. There are many, many songs that somehow highlight the lives of the martyrs, Palestinian martyrs, highlight heroes within the Palestinian community, and refer back to history, sort of affirming rootedness on the land, and also lamenting the loss and destruction that this land has been going through. So I think this tradition, which is a very old tradition, which one can relate it to the Arab world in its entirety, but also highlight the specialty of Palestine in terms of enriching the Arabic scene, whether in terms of poetry or music and song, and they are related. So there's another element of culture which is to do with tradition and embroidery, tatreez, intricate patterns that signify village origins, stone and metal work, pottery and weaving, often reflecting local flora and fauna. So Palestine is very famous for particularly the tatreez, and the tatreez, again, it sort of refers back, the embroidery very much relates to the origins of where people come from. So different parts of Palestine have different patterns, tatreez have different embroidery patterns, and people take a great pride in it. And again, in Gaza, particularly women who have really paid a huge, heavy price in Gaza, they are doing much of that tatreez as much as they could to keep that tradition alive. So many of these cultural patterns and practices are to do with affirming relationship to history, to roots, and also they have therapeutic also effects. Poetry, song, tatreez, all of these have therapeutic effects and have served particularly people or women who come from peasant background, village background in the West Bank. They can sell them, they sell their works and help their families through such practices and output. In general, Palestinian literature, very modern art, explores themes of displacement, identity, and resistance. And the artists who explore that is somebody like Najil Ali, Salman Mansour, and Mona Hattoum. Another very important cultural element is the food. And I didn't include some meaty things because I don't want to offend the vegetarians. But basically, you can see how important olives are for Palestinians. I heard a staggering number recently, which really concerned me. I have a few olive trees in Gaza myself, a very small plot of land. Unfortunately, as the Israelis destroyed our house, my family's house, they've also taken down the olive trees. Gaza used to have 1 million olive trees before the war. It's now down to 200,000 olive trees. It's absolutely devastating. Olive and palm trees in particular. And you can see people who talk about the environment, you can see the effects on the environment apart from the daily, bombing and killing and so on. This food is, I put it in honor of the Gazans in particular because that's what they eat almost every day now, or if they can get it, a little bit of bread and a little bit of olives, if they can get some olive oil, and some very basic food that they can get, if they can get hold of, and that's becoming also very, very hard. But obviously, historically, Palestinians have very famous dishes such as maqluba, meat or chicken dish, or msakhan, and all these they have roots in the Byzantine way of life in Palestine, in Syria, and Lebanon, because again, these were kind of one nation historically, in terms of geography, and in terms of topography and landscape. And also they shared similar spices, olive oil, and seasonal vegetables. Food as a reflection of heritage and way to maintain traditions. And the Palestinian diaspora also are a very important community in maintaining such traditions and honoring the Palestinians in this way. So this poster here really summarized the Palestinian history, I think. It says, Mish Nakba, Nakbat. We have lived through many catastrophes, many disasters. So obviously the archetypal point, the Nakba of 1948 is the major one, but then you have so many Nakbas until today, and now we are living, I think, Nakbat, the mother of all catastrophes. We really can't metaphorize it enough, but it's absolutely catastrophic. But the Nakba is the original archetypal point that destroyed the Palestinian community and created these scattered Palestinian communities. And out of that emerged the resilience of the Palestinian communities in the diaspora, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Egypt to some extent, and also in Europe. And actually, and for that, Palestinians have continued to uphold traditions and celebrate cultural identities by displacement and loss. I think from 1948 up to 1964, the emergence of the Palestine Liberation Organization, Palestinians really were just regarded as refugees. Give them aid, give them a charity, but completely forgotten by the world. So they completely, crossed over, and that's it. The story has finished. And Israel was much celebrated in the West. And those communities, those 500 villages that were destroyed in 1948, 500 plus villages that were destroyed in 1948 by Israel, just ceased to exist, basically. But thanks to culture, really, and people always refer to politics, but culture was very important, particularly poetry, in galvanizing people and reminding them of their homeland. And that galvanized people, and that led to, or contributed, if you'd like, to the creation and formation of the Palestine Liberation Organization, which recognized as the official body for Palestinian representation in 1964. And ever since, we've been struggling to gain or regain our rights. So culture has been, because for Palestinians, I mean, we have to remember, Palestinians don't have wealth. They don't have economic wealth. And in terms of their alliances in the world are very limited. You see how America, for example, is so brazen in its support for Israel. Europe also so brazen in its support throughout history for Israel. Palestinians do not have economic wealth, they don't have material wealth, but what they have contributed in terms of culture has been enormous. And you mentioned Edward Said, Mahmoud Darwish, Ghassan Kanafani, figures who really rose up and wrote the Palestinian story and sort of forced themselves on the world's map, on the world's culture, and refused to just die down, as Israel always wanted the Palestinians to do, just to disappear, basically. So it's been a struggle, a cultural struggle, alongside politics, of course, political narrative and so on, to be on the map, to be visible and to fight and to regain your right. And I think the Palestinians have been really remarkable at doing that. And you think of people like Mahmoud Darwish, born in the village of Berwe in 1941, which was destroyed by Israel, part of it turned into a stable for horses. Ghassan Kanafani, born in Akka, a storyteller, a novelist, assassinated in 1972 in Beirut. And Fadwa Tawqan, a poet from Nablus, a remarkable lady who wrote many poems about Palestinian experience. So those particular figures have written the Palestinian narrative, and I would very much recommend that you read them, because even though Ghassan Kanafani was killed in 1973 in Beirut, Mossad bombing, most likely, his stories are still very current. For example, Men in the Sun, very current. Even people now in Gaza refer to them in the West Bank. They just tell the story of this wandering refugee who's constantly targeted and who's meant to disappear but keep reappearing somehow and keep fighting. So literature as a tool for documenting history, expressing identity and resisting occupation. This has been very true of the Palestinian experience. And themes in Palestinian literature, homeland, exile, and resilience are common themes resonating with generation of Palestinians. So I said there's been recurrent themes in Palestinian literature, But I also want to emphasize that Palestinian literature is, although it is deeply rooted in political events and politics, it's actually mindful of art, an artistic sort of sensibility and creation. So it has developed. It has not been one. It's people really who want to be read worldwide. They want to be sort of worldly, in the word of Edward Said. They want to be read worldwide and seen as writing art that, although stemming from conditions of oppressions and exile and displacement, but also one that is and speaks to human conditions and existential in spirit. And that I think they've been really remarkable at doing that. You have so many books by, for example, Mahmoud Darwish, Ghassan Kanafani, and so on, that speaks to this point, I think. Again, we come to Edward Said. You have also, particularly in the 90s, there have been efforts creating museums in Palestine. This particular museum that you see the image of here below is in Birzeit, near Birzeit University, which is my university where I studied, in the West Bank. And you have cultural centers. I'm very sad about the Rashad al-Shawwa Cultural Center in Gaza that also was destroyed, a very important place, particularly where plays were performed, that was destroyed. And you have festivals worldwide preserve Palestinian culture. Palestinian communities play a vital role in preserving and promoting cultural traditions through festivals, exhibitions, and education. So there's been a very, as I said, because of the lack of economic influence, political influence, culture has come to play a very vital role for the Palestinians. And I think the most important voice for the Palestinians in the diaspora was, and I think still is, even though he passed away in 2003, is Edward Said, who was born in 1935 in Jerusalem and wrote a book particularly very influential was one of the first, particularly within the Western context in 1979, to write The Question of Palestine, which is absolutely current and really unparalleled. It's a very remarkable study of what happened to the Palestinians, of Zionism, also from the stand of its the standpoint of its victims, for example, one of the chapters. So Said is one of the main voices of the Palestinians. So if Mahmoud Darwish sort of galvanized the Arab world, and Ghassan Kanafani also showed the Arab world what happened in the Arabic language to the Palestinians. Edward Said fighting alone, really, in the 70s, very much fighting alone. His book, The Question of Palestine, was rejected a few times by publishers in America, but he insisted on it, and then it got published by a small publisher. And it's really one of the first books that has that breadth and depth of analysis and information that tells the Palestinian story from the standpoint of the Palestinians, because Zionism was so much celebrated in the West. The 1967 war was so much celebrated in the West. So you are celebrating colonialism, destruction of another community, which is, unfortunately, we see remnants of it even today. So I think Edward Said's voice is very much missed for the Palestinians. But the record that he left behind in such books like The Question of Palestine, After the Last Sky, again, another book that I very much recommend you read. It's absolutely a stunning portrayal of the Palestinians, particularly through images and so on and so forth. It's a very important book. So we have the scene now, contemporary art, film, and literature, young artists and filmmakers, poetry. Notable filmmakers like Ilya Suleiman and Anna Mary Jasser capture the nuances of Palestinian experience. So again, art has been bloodline for the Palestinian, spiritual bloodline for the Palestinian. And I think the Palestinians have not, unfortunately, gotten rights, but they have sort of asserted themselves and put themselves on the map through particularly their art. Even in Gaza now, in the midst of war, you find people making art. And you mentioned the book Out of Gaza. You find like Hiba Abu, which I did with a colleague, Alan Morrison, who actually initiated the idea of the book, and thankfully. And you have Hiba Abu Nada, who just before she was killed in Gaza, barely 31, she wrote poetry and posted it on Twitter, and so did Rifat al-Ar'ir. So we're lucky to have some of those voices of our martyrs. It's very sad to say this, but yeah, that's to refer to them as such, people who have died, because they are incredible with such potential, but we have lost them so young. And they are really a testament to a people. Israel, I think, a few of you have mentioned that Israel have tried to dehumanize the Palestinian, the way they are practicing violence in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, against the Palestinians, and also against the Lebanese, our brothers and sisters in Lebanon, is very much based on dehumanization, destroying their culture. Say they have no, for example, one of the first things they did in Gaza was to destroy Al-Umari Mosque. You know, Umari Mosque was built in 7th century in Gaza. So this killing of individuals who stand for culture is a very common practice of Zionism. And it's a ferocious one. We lose very precious souls. But people keep coming. And also now they want to die. We have an image of UNRWA there. UNRWA has been indispensable for Palestinian culture and for preserving Palestinian culture and literature. I mean, I grew up in Gaza and I studied at schools in Gaza, and we were all beneficiaries of the UNRWA education. So now Israel is targeting it because it knows that it gives a voice to the Palestinians, apart from supporting them economically, politically, but it also human rights and literature and art in particular. And it's been really an indispensable tool. And if you have followed this war, one common practice among the destruction of alongside the destruction of hospitals has been the destruction of schools and universities. So many centers, so many universities destroyed for the sake of destruction. I mean, I can't think of a worse crime than this, which is to rob future generation who are so keen on education as the Palestinian community are. I mean, the illiteracy rate is zero. People in Gaza, they all read and write, at least. When I grew up in Gaza in the 90s, the number of women going to universities, for example, was okay. But when I went last time in Gaza in 2018, every household have at least 1 or 2 women who go to university. So, and they have managed to do that because they believe in it, and it's a community that have risen through education, through art. And Israel, unfortunately, knows that. So they go and destroy these sources of existence to completely destroy this community culturally, politically, and spiritually. We can go on about that, but there's a lot of... and also, what has been good about Palestinian art is that it's developed. So you look at it in my other book, A Map of Absence, look at Palestinian literature during the British Mandate, 1918 to 1948. You have very remarkable poetry, really, but still within the old Qasida tradition, the old formulaic kind of Qasida tradition. But after that, the 1960s, you have people writing free verse poetry, for example. And then in the 1990s, you have writing about nature, not always directly political, very subtle, and sort of amalgamates different elements so that it reads as a piece with different voices within it somehow. And that's been a great development. And so is the music scene, and so is the popular culture scene, and every scene in Palestine has witnessed good development. So Palestinian culture, in a nutshell, is a tapestry, and I hope I haven't bored you. I see some of you sleeping. I hope you woke up. I know I've talked for a long time, maybe, but I'll stop very soon. Palestinian culture is a tapestry woven from ancient history, resilience, and a love for the land. Despite challenges, the Palestinian people continue to celebrate and preserve their rich heritage. Palestinian culture is both deeply rooted and dynamically evolving, with a tradition that inspire hope and pride among Palestinians worldwide. Thank you for listening.